So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit to you about my philosophy of teaching Latin, or some small aspects of it, a couple of things that are important to me about teaching Latin. And, you know, on the one hand, this is because I want you to see that I've got resources to offer you that will be good for your students and possibly even good for you personally. But on the other hand, it's also because I think there are some things that I've learned in my in the very many mistakes I've made in my Latin study and practice through the years that I think are helpful ways to they lead to some insights that make it easier for us to reorient ourselves a little bit. So I hope it's not purely an exercise in self-indulgence, that it actually connects with you and your own experience. If it does, obviously excited to explore that. If it doesn't, hey, maybe I should hear that and say like, hey man, you're crazy. Nobody thinks like you. It's like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I'll go home now. Um, but at any rate, I hope you'll find it interesting and potentially illuminating. So as far as my stuff goes, I really specialize in two things. I specialize in answers to the why questions, and I also specialize in humanizing the Latin language as a form of communication. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of those. Why questions, right? You guys have had the why questions. You know the why questions. Why does the dative plural look this way? Why isn't there an ending for the nominative case? All those types of why questions. These are often pushed aside in the traditional classroom setting. And I think the reasons why these why questions are pushed aside are generally good ones. And here are some of them. One reason is because these questions often involve concepts that are outside of the student's experience. And so it's hard to answer a question about the dative plural, why it looks that way, when the students have never heard of comparative morphology or vowel collisions or any of these other sorts of things. The second thing is that the answers are often speculative. We don't always know for certain or with any amount of scientific or historical accuracy what the real answer to the question is. It's just our best guess. Third reason is, look, we're all working with limited classroom time, and we all know that we don't have as much time to present material as we'd like to. And so even the necessary material that's got to get out there for whatever our pedagogical ends are, we don't always get to all of that kind of stuff, if we're honest. And so to have extra time to talk about these why questions is often a luxury we just can't afford. And another reason is it may be that your training as the teacher doesn't extend to these why questions. Both because in the classroom that you were in, all of the things that are true in your classroom were probably also true. Namely, they were outside of your experience, and they were speculative, and there wasn't enough class time to do those types of things. And so, generally speaking, these why questions will require a study of comparative morphology with at least reference to Greek, and ideally also to another branch of the Indo-European family. They require a study of Indo-European phonology. They require a study of non-standard Latin forms, very early forms and post-classical forms. And so because of all of that, there's this consensus that we have that those questions can safely be ignored below the specialist level, right? If you're going to do a master's degree or a PhD in classics, then you can get into those questions. But for the average bachelor's degree in classics, for the high school students, let's not get into all of that stuff. Let's just try to memorize these stupid forms, right? Let's just get our declensions down, maybe learn a couple of relative pronouns and get us to the Latin exam. I think, as I said at the outset, I think these are all very good reasons why these things are often excluded from the classroom. But I also think there are good reasons to push back against this exclusion. And I'm going to list just two of those reasons. The first reason is that when we refuse these questions, we often give the impression to the students that there can be no answer to such questions, that the Latin language is the way it is just because. Indeed, how can we not wind up in this place, right? If every classroom below the graduate classics level pushes the why questions aside, and if most Latin teachers don't have graduate degrees in Latin, then you're going to reach a situation where neither the student's teacher, nor that person's teacher, nor that person's teacher has ever heard answers to the why questions. Eventually, someone is going to draw the conclusion that there cannot be any such answers. Indeed, if you have ever told your students or been told yourself that some aspect of Latin morphology is just the way it is, that it has no explanation, this is likely because you've been the victim of an expediency that has led to a lack of understanding about the nature and history of Latin morphology, right? Okay, great, but who cares, right? As long as they memorize their declensions and can A, get a good score on the AP Latin exam, or B, read the text that whoever the gods, the powers that be that are in charge of your curriculum have said they're going to have to read someday. As long as those conditions attain, who cares, right? You've done your job, we've gotten them there. Well, I care, at the risk of sounding like Luke Skywalker, and I think you should too, because when the Latin language is conceived as being arbitrary in this way, as being a collection of forms that are just the way they are, because who knows, there's no reason why. It's detached from its own history and from its living relationship to cognate languages like Greek. This is the first step to treating Latin like a dead thing. Okay, fine, but let's get really brutal here. Who cares? Who cares if Latin is treated like a dead thing? Who cares if the students think Latin is a dead language? Who cares if it's in fact a dead language or not, as long as the students can actually read? Okay, now here's where you need to know something really fundamental about me. It's really the core of all of my pedagogy, not just when I teach Latin. I believe that teaching doesn't aim at familiarity. It aims at mastery. That's when you're well instructed. The successful Latin student is not one who can translate a sentence, but one who can read a sentence. You know that difference, right? Well, I used to teach Latin to doctoral students at Yale, and they were whiny, but they also were motivated because it wasn't in the classics department. I had all the PhD students at Yale who needed Latin for research, but were not classicists, wound up in my class. And so they had something that PhD students in classics don't have, which is a living terror that this is just never going to work for them. And that if it doesn't work, they've got to change their lives. Like they literally can't finish their degree and go be scholars in whatever thing they want to be scholars in because, man, I really want to be an expert in Thomas Aquinas, or I want to be an expert in medieval culinary arts. I actually had a student like that. He's fantastic. He was a beer brewer and he did his PhD in medieval food. And man, he did cool stuff. But I can't do it because the texts are untranslated. And so if I can't read Latin, I actually can't read the text that I want to study. And so they came to me with a great deal of anxiety from where they were in their Latin study, which was for the most part, okay, they've been through the grammar, right? They've done Wheelock's or they've done Mullen and Fleischer or something like that. They could see how they might one day be able to work their way through Latin sentences with a dictionary and several grammar books and a lot of time and a great support network and a few holy relics, right? But what they needed to be able to do was to read Latin texts, which might be several hundred pages long, right? Behind me on the shelf, you see those blue books there, right there, it's Thomas Aquinas, right? If you gotta know what Thomas Aquinas says about something, you can't open one of those up and start working sentences. It's too slow. You've got to be able to just read those things. You can't read a text if you have to work every sentence. The goal is not to be able to translate. The goal is to be able to read and think Latinly. But it's going to be hard to do that if the language is taking an abstraction from its own development. And this brings me to my second reason for not excluding these why questions. And that is that I think these answers actually help students. It's not just a question of what are you missing if you don't have the why questions. I think having them can actually help students. And let me be clear about this. I'm not saying that the answers to these questions form some sort of magical key through which all of Latin becomes easy. Memorization becomes a snap. Obscure syntactical concepts like the ablative of the Ides of March become instantly clear. And Latin learning looks more like something from the Matrix than from Monty Python. If I had that power, my grand designs on absolute galactic authority would at last be complete, and all would bow before me as the wretches they are. I would teach better. So that's not the case. Nevertheless, knowing that the declensional system is the result of phonological collisions produced by adding a common set of endings to words with different thematic letters actually does help with memorization. And knowing what those original endings were, to the best of our ability to reconstruct them, helps immensely with memorization. Why? because it gives the students something to hang their hats on. This is really a point about educational psychology. It feels harder to learn something if it's just random, or if you believe it's just random. If there's a reason for it, or even if we just think there's a reason for it, then it's easier to learn. Why? Because it's possible to see it as connected to other facts. And it's these connections between facts that generate that specific nexus of meaning that we call truth. Or to put it simply and practically, if we're going to be crass and practical about this, then let's get practical. If X is this way for a reason, and if I can remember the reason, even if I can't remember X, I have a better chance of remembering it. I have another path to come at that knowledge. Right? I think it's always important as a teacher to take note of a student's heart. When a student asks why the forms are this way, several things could be happening. One, they could, of course, be expressing mere exasperation, right? It's like they're saying, oh, why is this so hard? Why are these stupid forms this way? Or it could be a challenge meant to lead not to deeper learning, but to disengagement. I shouldn't have to do this. This is dumb. Your students don't say that, right? That's just my students. But it could also be a longing to understand how this could possibly make sense. That does happen. I know that's the teacher's dream. That's the mythical holy grail of teaching. A student can't see how something makes sense, but deeply longs to see that it could make sense, right? That student in that position, that hypothetical mythological student, is not only willing to be drawn deeper down the rabbit hole, she is also possessed of the suspicion that there is something really worth knowing if she goes down there. These moments are never as common as we teachers would like, and when they happen, they're more important than anything else on our lesson plan, right? When you see one of those moments happen, that's a true teachable moment. Stop what you're doing and feed that flame, because that's why you're in this, right? Okay, but like I said, that student may not exist or only exist in stories, but even if a student is only having a moment of frustration or rebellion, pointing out to the student that there is a logic can, on the one hand, give them the will to push through the frustration, right? Well, at least it's not for no reason. Or it can chasten their dismissiveness. It's not stupid. It's highly logical, actually. Right? Okay, enough about that. Now, a quick thought on my second area of specialization, which is to make the language more human. We have a tendency to see Latin as this horrible monster created for the sole purpose of tormenting students. And indeed, given what we know of the Romans, we can't rule this out prima facie, right? They were totally the kind of people to invent a language just to annoy and confound conquered peoples and future ages. That's right up their alley. Just look at how many words they have for putting someone to death and how gruesomely specific they are. And yet, of course, this is bogus. Right? This is a thesis developed by my favorite academic, Spurius Dubius Bogus, because languages aren't thought up, right? They develop. The Romans developed their language with an eye to its practical use. That is, it needed to be able to be specific and accurate. And this leads them to keep some of the difficult forms they inherited. Some of the really hard forms, like, look, you got rid of the dual number, which is stupid anyway. It's either singular or it's plural. Dual is plural. Duh, Greek. You got rid of the octative. What do you need that for? Just do it with the subjunctive. Why did you keep so much other hard stuff? You didn't go far enough. Look at English. We got rid of everything, right? And look how easy our language is to use. Why didn't you keep going, Romans? It's a half measure. Well, because the hard stuff enables them to be accurate. And so that's why they've got to hang on to some of that stuff. But it's also got to be nimble enough to use to stop your kid from running in front of the chariot, or to scold your husband, or to tell him you love him, or to get the cat off the table, or to communicate terse commands in battle, to laugh with one's friends over drinks, to love, to mourn, to dream, to fear, to rage. In short, all those things that real humans do that make up the fabric of their lives. And so, yes, there's a word for skinning someone alive, and it's brilliant, right? Ex carnificio, to make them be outside of their flesh. So good. But there's also a word for underwear and bathing suit. The goal here is the same. To forge a connection between the student and the language that facilitates the student's entry into the mind of the language. Got to make that easier for the student. We got to introduce them and smooth the path into the way Latin thinks, feels, reasons, and imagines. The goal is to develop what the Germans call Sprachgefühl, a feel for the language. You just got an instinct for it. The sense of what is idiomatic and what is not. I can't tell you how many times in language study I would ask one of my language teachers, hey, can I say this? And he would reply, I mean, you can say it. It's not grammatically incorrect, but no native speaker would ever say that. Right. What I was understanding the grammar correctly. There's no reason I can't say this, right? But what I didn't have yet was a sense of what is likely, what's normal. I had a friend in graduate school who was Dutch. Where's Diana? There's Diana Vredefeld. I don't know how you pronounce your last name, but that's a great Dutch last name, Vredefeld. His name was not that, but he was Dutch, and his English was of course excellent. But he spoke with an accent, which was delightful. I would say his English was better then than my Dutch is now. But he had this. There were a couple of things he never quite got right, and so where we would say something like, "So at the moment, I'm studying this particular concept." He wouldn't say "at the moment." He would say "in the moment," which is, of course, exactly how you would say it in Dutch or in German, right? In the moment, whatever the case would be for that situation. But so in English, he always said that a little bit off. We always knew what he meant, and we didn't correct him about that because we weren't going to be jerks about it. And it was always kind of funny, and I always really liked it. But that was one place where his feel for the language was imperfect, right? He didn't get that, no, there's absolutely no reason we can't say it this way, but it turns out that's not the way we say it. If we can get the students to that place where they begin to get even just the beginnings of a sense of the feel for the language. Oh, yeah, you could say it this way in Latin, but that's not the Latin way to do it. A Latin writer would do it this way. I dare you to keep that student from getting excited, right? It's going to start to, their energy and their interest and their encouragement, their desire to learn the language is going to become self-sustaining at that point. Because now it's like, oh, wait, that makes sense. Oh, that's a whole different way of thinking about things. I want to know more. Give me more. Come on, teacher, what's next in the book? Right. And when we do that, we get the students there, our job is easy because now instead of having to sell the students something they don't want to buy, boy, if I got a deal for you, now we're just responding to their desire and feeding them what they're hungry for. And at that point, you can just kick back and watch the joy roll in. So that's a quick look at what I'm about. There's obviously a lot more to my linguistic pedagogy. There's a lot of method that I'm not going into right now, but everything I do really revolves around these two things, right? It's about getting into those why questions, and it's about helping students to fall in love with the language by recognizing that it's a human form of communication, that its speakers face the same types of struggles, concerns, frustrations, joys, hopes, dreams, fears, whatever that you do. And in fact, that's also a big part of the reason why I'm into the why questions. Because again, it helps to humanize the language. It's no longer now a code, right? The difference between a language and a code is that a language is meant to allow people access to what is being said, and a code is meant to deny people access to what is said. Too often our students get this impression, and too often we encourage unintentionally this impression that Latin is a code. That the point is for them to not get it. And so they've got to beat their heads against it and try to break the code and conquer it and get in there. There's something fun about that, but it's less fun than actually learning to see this as a lens through which humans saw the world and as a means that humans use to express their desires and hopes and fears about the world. Okay, so let me thank you for indulging me to this point. Let me beg a few more minutes of indulgence from you and tell you a little bit about how I turn that around into specific courses. And that's, on the one hand, this is where I can come in and help you, because if maybe you don't have facility in 12 languages across the entire Indo-European language group, and maybe your Greek's not so hot, or maybe it's non-existent at all, and maybe you haven't had the luxury of reading widely and deeply in Latin literature because you've been forced to stay focused on this little bit of the classical period or whatever else. And so, how do you do what I'm talking about if your background doesn't set you up for that? Well, it's simple. You go back to graduate school, you put in a couple hundred more hours of study, get a couple more thousand pages of Latin text under your belt, maybe learn a few more languages, and you're good to go, right? Okay, really not the most practical advice you've ever been given, definitely not worth the price of admission, but a lot of my services are developed with an eye to being able to come into what you're already doing and provide you those pieces in what you're doing without you having to go and do that work yourself. So the first thing that I want to let you know about is what I would call teacher services, something I do for you guys. And that's a course that I have that's starting in 2 weeks, a week from Monday, called Subar Boost. I emailed some of you about this ahead of time. And that's for, the idea is maybe you want to go deeper in this study so that you can begin to develop more of a way of thinking about the language that can help you to come at it in this living sort of way that I'm talking about. Strengthen your own feeling of the language so it's easier for you to guide students into that same thing. This is a continuing ed opportunity for you that can help can help those who've done the work of learning close the gap to mastery. And it's especially focused on that second part of the things that I do, humanizing the language. And we're going to do a lot of why questions too. And a lot of what I do there is go back through your Latin training and go back through your Latin textbooks that you learned from Wheelock's and Mullen and Fleischer particularly, and take apart some of the things they're saying and put them back together a little differently. And show how this works pretty well if you're just looking at Cicero and Caesar. It works pretty well if you ignore Celestius. But once you broaden your horizons and you bring not just Celestius, but also Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Erasmus and other folks into the picture, this isn't a very good description of how the Latin language works, actually. And then if we compare that back to what Cicero does, not in his speeches, but in his letters, we see that actually the description of Cicero isn't the best description of Cicero because he doesn't talk that way to his wife, right? So there's definitely a lot of that why bit to it as well. It aims at the feel for the language I was talking about by means of rigorous morphological and syntactical analysis and examination of a variety of texts from the entire history of the language, showcasing the full range of idiomatic Latin. This makes it an excellent continuing ed opportunity, and at just $500 a student, it's a lot softer on the school's budget than comparable alternatives. And because it's done over Zoom like this, you don't have to move somewhere for the summer and figure out how you're going to live there and all this other sort of thing. Another thing that's going to be going on for teachers that I want you guys to be aware of is I'm just about to launch sometime in the next, month or so, depends on how my class prep goes, a series of colloquia like this one that are on special topics in Latin pedagogy or grammar. So we'll do an evening on the subjunctive, and we'll just talk about the logic of the subjunctive, right? What does it really mean? What is it really used for? Can we talk about a single use of the subjunctive, a single intuition of what the subjunctive is that accounts for all of the other uses to which it gets put in Latin, right? I think we can. And so I'll do a session like that. Those are going to be free. It's going to be just this same sort of situation. You'll sign up for it, register by Zoom and come, and we'll just have those conversations. And what I'm aiming to do it on that is I'm aiming to provide you a low stress, low energy, continuing ed opportunity that allows you to continue to go forward in Latin, to fellowship with other like-minded teachers, to share ideas and thoughts and that sort of thing in a way that doesn't really ask anything of you but your time. And I'm doing that because I believe in what you do as a teacher. And I believe, I'm not in the front lines teaching. I'm back in the camp supporting you guys, but I believe in what you guys do on the front line, so that's something I want to do. So you're going to find yourself on the mailing list tomorrow. Stay on the mailing list, keep an eye out for those things, and you'll also get opportunities to vote and express your own thoughts about what you'd like to see topics for some of those things. So that's the kind of stuff I do for you guys. I've also got some services for your students. And these are courses that are meant to be plugged into what's already going on in a school setting and provide an opportunity to pursue some of what I was talking about tonight without interrupting the curriculum of the school. So one of the programs are Latin boot camps, and these are 1 week interventions. that are designed to do just that. Bootcamp Level 1, which is actually good for all learners of the Latin language, introduces principles about language and communication in general, with a special focus on Latin versions of these problems and strategies. So they'll actually get to thinking about how does language work in the first place? And what are its goals? What's it good at? What's it bad at? How does that play out in Latin specifically, right? So it doesn't really matter whether they just started their study of Latin or whether they're just about to finish it. No, we don't have time to teach that in the classroom and in the Latin classroom. And so this will help to put some more meat on the bones of what they've been learning. Bootcamp Level 2 is for learners in the first stages of Latin learning, generally those who are still learning declensions and verb forms. And this bootcamp is a close dive into Latin morphology, including its historical development. If you like what I said about answering the why questions, but are still limited by your own knowledge and what you have time for in class, this bootcamp can fill in those gaps for your students without forcing you to change what you're doing. Because that's exactly what that's focused on, is let's go through all the declensions and let's see how they're formed. What are our best guesses as to what the original endings were? And let me show you what happens when we take those endings and put them on a word ending with A, on a word ending with O, on a word ending with a consonant. Look, it's first declension, it's second declension, it's third declension. Right? Here are basic principles of that. Looking at all the verb forms. Yes, you've got to memorize all of these different things, right? The verb chart is massive. But let's go through and talk about the principles of formation for all of the different tenses and all the different moods so we understand what's at stake, right? Let's make sure we notice the correspondence between the imperfect and the pluperfect subjunctive, right? The imperfect subjunctive is formed by adding a personal ending directly to the present active infinitive. And somehow by doing that, the intuition is it pushes it back in time a little bit and makes it subjunctive. The pluperfect subjunctive is formed in the same way. You take a personal ending and put it on the perfect active infinitive. And if you go further back from the perfect, obviously you're going to arrive at a pluperfect sense, right? Why don't we teach this? It's amazing. It's like, right. Well, okay, you've got to show them how to learn these forms. This is going to help to give them more strategies, more approaches to come at some of those things. And you're going to see their retention go up. You're going to see their memorization improve almost overnight, over a week, let's say. And you don't have to do anything. Bootcamp Level 3 is for advanced students who've moved past morphology and are now working in syntax. Thus, they're doing a lot more translation, and they've started reading text. At first, there'll be little made-up sentences and then made-up paragraphs, but pretty soon, most of the curriculum you guys are using are going to start giving them excerpts, even if adapted excerpts from real Latin text, right? These guys have done all this work learning all this morphology, and now they're faced with a completely different task than that, which is syntactical wisdom, which nothing or very little in their study of morphology has prepared them for. So what I'm going to do in this bootcamp is focus on techniques that facilitate identification of syntactical structures and therefore facilitate fast and, most important, accurate translation. Those are the Latin bootcamps. There's also, and this is a kind of a cool thing, especially if you're teaching at a school that has a Latin program that all of the students or the majority of students are following, and they're sort of moving through that program by their age. So all the 7th graders are in Latin 1, all the 8th graders, or whatever it looks at your school. Or also for any student that for whatever reason is behind where they need to be. This is called junioribus subarboribus, right? Subarboribus for juniors. It's an intensive Latin on-ramp designed to catch students up to the 2nd or 3rd year of Latin study, depending on how your school lays things out, in 1 month of summer study. This is useful for students transferring in from other schools where they haven't been doing a Latin program, but you need them to be in Latin 3 because that's the age that they're at. Or it's also useful for a student who's just getting started and wants a head start on what they're doing, wants to jump off more quickly. Maybe you've got a really promising student who's super interested in Latin, is starting late, would like to be able to skip Latin 1 and jump right into Latin 2. If you can say, hey, do this summer program, and coming out of it, I know you'll be ready to join us in Latin 2. That's a nice trick to have in your pocket as a teacher. Makes you look amazing, right? This course has some flexibility in terms of where it begins and ends, but the general notion is to spend 1 week catching everyone up to a basic level, which is knowledge of first and second declension and the present system of all verbs. And then we'll go on from there to get them through the rest of the declensional and verbal system, along with the most fundamental uses of cases and the basic structures of syntax by the end of the month. They will look at relative clauses. They will look at conditionals. They will look at purpose clauses. They will learn various uses, the most common uses of the ablative and dative and whatnot. right? Now, you might be thinking, there's no way that a student can do all that in 1 month and retain any of it, right? Nice fairy tale you're selling there, but we're not buying it. We're too experienced for that. I get where you're coming from, but I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. I've done it a bunch of times. The key is that the students have to keep going, right? If someone does this class and then doesn't do Latin in the fall, they're going to lose all of it. But if they keep going, they continue to practice and review what they've learned, then it sticks and it's theirs forever. And I stress this to parents signing up to such an extent that one of the questions on the registration form is, what are your plans for Latin in the fall? don't sign up for this class if you don't have a plan for what you're going to do in the fall, because you're wasting your money and your kids' time. Right. So those are the services that I offer for your students. The last thing I want to tell you about is something I'm really excited about. It's a new program for us. It's called Latin Fundamentals for Parents. And what this is the course designed to help parents who've had no previous Latin study or who have forgotten the Latin study they did in their distant youth, shrouded by myths of legend and myth. It's to help them get acquainted with the language so that they can help their children with their homework. And more importantly, converse with their children about what they're learning. In 4 90-minute sessions held weekly over a course of a month, parents will learn how the declensional and verbal systems work, how to make the various forms, the basics of Latin syntax, pronunciation, and study skills, what works and what doesn't work for their kids when they're studying language. I'm really excited about this because when a student really catches the vision for Latin study, they want to talk about it all the time. And it can be hard to find people to talk about it with. To be able to talk about it with your parents and have your parents meaningfully understand what you're on about could mean the difference between this energy petering out or turning into a steady blaze. And then lastly, I also offer specialized studies. There may be something that your school needs, whether for your faculty or for your students, from evening colloquia to day-long faculty in-services, even to longer ongoing projects. I'm open to talking with you about what might be something we could do to help your Latin program do what you're trying to do best.